mean, I think the war, everybody realizes that the war was an internal factor in Yugoslavia that came about as a result of the ending of the Cold War and the collapse of the Yugoslav economy and then the political institutions. And clearly, Bosnia-Herzegovina, the issue of Bosnia-Herzegovina emerged quite strongly at that moment because of all the regions in the former Yugoslavia. It was the one which clearly had a mix of ethnic groups and with different interests, and that those made it more difficult in the case of Bosnia to resolve the question of its status, independence, should it remain part of the former Yugoslavia, etc. And because of the ways in which the international community played its role in Bosnia, that people taking various sides, the conflict became, the situation was exacerbated. As we all know, the election was held when there was a reserve boycott of the election, and Bosnia was declared a sovereign state. And then, of course, that fell into conflict. And we know the long and sad tragedy of that period from 1992 to 1995. I've often said that the Balkans was the problem nobody ever wants, but it's the problem that often comes back and presents itself in very bold ways. Clearly, Bosnia was a problem in the international community that no one wanted to address if they could possibly address it, and I think there were many, many compromises. Clearly, early on, the division of the country, which took place during the war, was clearly one that was created divisions which became harder and harder to undo. And I think when the Dayton Agreement was negotiated, clearly the international community took a view that it wanted something like a balance, a status quo in the situation. Instead of returning Bosnia to the previous situation, it more or less accepted the rough divisions of the country. I mean, the U.S. had gotten the Croats and the Bosniaks to agree through the Washington Agreement, but then the Dayton Agreement was an attempt to solidify a balance on the ground in which each ethnic group had its own sort of stake in the country, and the Serbs got what they wanted, which was a particular part of Bosnia, which they could claim as their own. And so in many ways, the agreement was a troubling and difficult agreement because it was going to accept the war circumstances, and it was going to create circumstances at the end of the conflict which made it very difficult for Bosnia to be put back together in the way it was before the conflict. And I think the international community took the view from Dayton. Dayton was clearly designed to end the war. But the building of the peace, or the creation of the events, the situation in terms of the political settlement, was clearly not viewed with something that they really wanted to get involved in, but they got involved in. They couldn't finish. The war situation was such that as you know, so many of the annexes were left not fully developed, purposely so, because they really couldn't come to agreement. And I think that they came to believe that perhaps by using the Dayton Agreement as a basis, they could rebuild the country, put it back together. And I believe that the U.S. in particular had a view that it would use Dayton, and particularly the Constitution, to reintegrate Bosnia, to create a stronger central state, to move the country towards a functioning state in which all interests were protected. But that was easier said than done, because in reality, I think that the truth of it is that every day that the country was divided was another day it was going to be divided at the other end. And facts on the ground, that is the division of the country, the Serbs realized that they got an especially good deal out of Bosnia. It gave them what they wanted, which was a secure land inside Bosnia, which they believed would protect their ethnic interests far better than any political or constitutional settlement would be. And I think that the international community hoped that it could cobble together things. And for many years it was making progress, slow progress on this front. I think the major event which shifted everybody's interest was clearly 9/11. The U.S. had to clearly then turn its attention elsewhere. it always did want to hand the issue of how to resolve Bosnia's political situation to the Europeans. They believe that this is ultimately a problem for the European Union to solve. That was never possible because the problem was Bosnia itself wasn't resolved, and therefore the European Union was the last entity to be able to resolve it, itself being uncertain as to its own reality. And so I think 9/11 disengaged the United States, and that disengagement has remained a core element of the U.S. approach to Bosnia ever since. Help where we can, avoid becoming too engaged, where possible let the Europeans take the lead. If we can help, wherever we need to help, wherever we can nudge the Europeans and the Bosnians to come together, we will, but we're not going to play a central role unless we have to. But invariably, they do find that they have to, and invariably they have to stay engaged because they know that the U.S. has to stay engaged because it knows that without its pressure, there will be no progress in Bosnia. And so today we're in a situation where the country is it's a complex way. I think it's very difficult to describe the situation in the country. On the one hand, it's very bad. On the one hand, it's more divided than ever. On the other hand, I think that the notion that the country is going to break up is overblown. I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think it's in nobody's interest in the international community to see that happen. And the international community recognizes that right now the situation is stagnating. They want to do something. The question is what to do, how far to go, because the problem is that the United States re-engages. It's kind of like opening up a Pandora's box. If you start to negotiate a little bit, historically it can lead to quite a lot, and a bit more. It can re-radicalize the environment in some ways because of the fears that it will generate. And so the United States is attempting to think about ways to keep, this is why Dayton has to keep being Dayton in one sense, is that the alternatives are seen as so unpredictable as to be dangerous for the international community. And given all the other major problems in the world, Bosnia, as long as it's at peace for people, is better than, let's say, going in and creating a new problem. In other words, so it's often hard to see that why the international community acts as ambivalently or as difficultly as it does, but largely because it has so many issues that it's trying to deal with. What it does not want to do is to make matters worse, and it knows it has limits. That said, the international community will attempt after the elections to try to deal with the issue of the dysfunctionality of the country. There will be some effort to re-engage on this issue, to fix the problems that exist within Dayton. I think, as one person said to me the other day in the State Department, that, we take 2 steps forward, 1 back. We're making more progress right now. We're quietly moving forward, and that's not. Let's not say that there's anything out there that they've planned or developed, but they're trying to create the atmosphere for, let's say, resolving, in some ways, some of the problems that the country faces, so it can enter into, the SAA properly, the security, the SAA agreement with the EU, so that it can perhaps move forward in a partnership with NATO, that the country can begin to address some of its internal economic and social problems. The challenge right now, one of the issues that I think the country faces is that the state government has been so weakened that a lot of the governing is being done, as you can tell, jointly by the entities. That is often, recently, for example, when the Prime Minister said that he couldn't declare a national emergency because the entities could do that. That's the problem with leaving that situation go, and I believe that the U.S. recognizes this, is that Bosnia could end up devolving into a federal union rather than a sovereign state with 2 entities or such, which could eventually lead to a situation where the country could be, for all intents and purposes, de facto divided some people would like to see that, but that's not where they needed to go. And so they are aware of that situation. And, of course, the recent flooding has created a new set of circumstances which have revealed again the great divides that exist, and in some ways that is a situation which on one level one might think about. They're talking about having a donor conference this coming month on this issue. We haven't had a donor conference since 1996, if I'm not incorrect. And donor conferences are very interesting events because that might provide an opportunity for, let's say, how to deal with this problem, because the problem of the countries, the public service issue, the public emergency issue that has exposed the political problem, they're not unconnected. And so perhaps I know that on some level that is an interesting situation that people have been aware of or are thinking about. So, and I think at the end of the day, too, people are realize that 20 years is 20 years, and it's time to move. We've been in this country for 20 years in this international situation, and it's time to find a way out of that. If this is what Bosnia is like, what's the situation going to be like in other places that we are more deeply invested in? If we can't resolve this problem, how are we going to be able to resolve the much more complex problems? And as you can see, where the much more complex problems in Iraq and Afghanistan have, we're still dealing with that on a military level. So Bosnia is sort of a litmus test. Can we finish a project? Can we actually bring this to these kinds of interventions to a successful conclusion? Can peace implementation processes work? And so I say these things because I know that the problem is complex. It's not easily resolved by saying we should just do this or she should just do that. It's not black and white. The country has always been mixed. It's been made up of different groups who have different interests. That is a reality that exists on the ground and always exists. It's not going to be like the other places in some ways. And I think that factor has to always be considered in any resolution. I think it was deep frustration with the lack of progress economically and socially since the war. I think there was widespread, let's say, frustration with the governments at all levels. But I also think that the movement happened so quickly. It developed like a lot of movements these days, where it takes on a life of its own through the media, takes on a life of its own, and what happens is everybody collectively wants to do something, but there's that idea of developing political leaders who want to, let's say, take institutions and exploit them for purposes of making political progress and social progress, etc. That seems to be, people seem reluctant to do this. The idea that the movement was leaderless. This happened in the U.S. movements, Wall Street, the protest movement. You could even say that the Tea Party movement had the same problem. Everybody's reluctance to be a leader and to be anti-institutional tends to take the movements, even if they have legitimate claims, and run them to ground. They become, in a sense, powerless politically. People wanted to have these general plenums, and public democracy is a great thing, but the reason why it often doesn't work is just because everybody's engaged in it, and there's nobody that's been designated to carry out the responsibilities of doing these sorts of things. And in a way, what the failure of the movement to crystallize itself into a political movement, where there would be emergent leaders who articulated these sentiments, was, I think, a major factor in its failure. Is that there were people like, many people that you know very well, but the issue of becoming, this idea of not wanting to be like a politician, not wanting to be involved in government. It's a problem I've actually run into before in Bosnia, is that because of the long history of communism, say, or socialism, opposition to government means non-participation in it. It does, in other words, you're opposed to it because anything to do with it is a bad thing. And in a way, this idea that you use protest movements to build political movements, to build new parties, to build new institutions, or to work with existing institutions, never seemed to take hold in Bosnia because the institutions are so discredited. It's part of the problem. It's kind of like the problem with in Egypt and other places, and even in Tunisia for a while, is that the government institutions were so discredited by the way they were badly run that nobody wanted anything to do with it. But I think the protest movement failed because ultimately it didn't fail. It's still there, and a lot of the sentiments and concerns are still there. But the vehicles that were emerged from it were probably vehicles that were not going to get it to go where it needed to go. It needed, and in that sense, the movement was you could say it was almost the second step. There had been protests the year before. This was the second step. It was further evolved. You could argue that the elections and what comes forward, that there might be a third step in this process. But I think, unfortunately, it was the failure to translate that at the level it needed to be translated. It wasn't just about local officials being corrupt. The level of the cantons is an important level for a lot of these concerns, but the real concerns, the real way to deal with this had to be at the next level. It had to be, broadly speaking, at the entity level and then at the state level. And it never got there. It just seemed to me that it was cauterized at the level of the cantons and the municipalities, but at the level, and in the federation it existed, but nowhere. And I think the same frustrations exist in the RS. Same frustrations existed, but in the RS is more like an old socialist state with, it's a state in which people are afraid to necessarily always express their views. It's an entity in which I think the free voicing of concerns is there's a lot of pressure to keep quiet, not to protest. But I think the same issues were present there as they were in the Federation. I don't think it was distinct to the Federation at all. That's just my view, and it could be wrong on these sorts of things. Anybody's view is subject to, but my feeling is that I see it too often in protest movements these days in the U.S. where nobody wants to lead. Everyone wants to do it on the internet. Everyone wants to say we're all equal, and nobody's going to actually work in a public way, in a public institution to do things. It's sort of, they're so discredited, nobody wants to do it. And unfortunately, that's the only way it's going to work, is actually public engagement directly in, working with institutions to change this situation. These things take time to build up, and you did have time in February. It's too late now. And what will be interesting to see is, what the campaign is run on, whether anyone will acknowledge some of these issues in a more substantive way. It's the unwillingness of some people to, forming a political party, perhaps, a couple of political parties would have been a way to go, because all the ones that now exist are all part of the existing Dayton reality. But I think that moment may have passed to do that. It's not to say it can't still be done. There's elections every 2 years in Bosnia, so there's always a chance. The real question is that what will happen between now and the end of the year? And remain to be seen. One doesn't know when this election gets started what it may generate. I think that's an unknown factor. I don't think anybody could have predicted that the situation in February might have occurred and developed as it did. And so the election may well be a catalyst for these kinds of things, but it's hard to say. And a lot of people, some of my friends back here in the U.S., I'm actually in France, as you know, but a lot of my friends were very saying, oh, we should use this as an opportunity, we should go and pursue change and engage and so forth. But there really wasn't anybody to talk to, in some ways about this. There wasn't, and I think that everybody kind of needed to stand back and see where this is really going. In other words, everybody said, let's talk to the people on the phone, let's hear what they have to say. But I think there was no space there yet to have that kind of discussion. The plenums were not fully developed. Where they were going was not clear. What they would eventually become, was unclear, and I think people stood back and waited to see what would happen. And I think in the end it proved wise to do that, because I didn't think there was enough yet to work with. Well, because many of the places where the protests are occurring, the government institutions aren't working. The promises, if you talk about, for example, in the Middle East and the Arab states where the Arab Spring was taking place, the governments had so, how should I say, disabused themselves of being what they claimed they were, democratic sovereign states. They'd become so utterly corrupted from the original principles. A lot of the founding presidents of those states had started to create a mechanism, and then, as you know, the process became fossilized, and what happened is the credibility of governments on any level was undermined, so thoroughly undermined. And the only institutions that seemed viable in some states were the army, because it always seems that way to some states. But the idea of turning to the governments, turning to using government institutions, people felt they were suspicious. They were aware of the impact of corruption. They were the absence of the rule of law, so there was no certainty that violence wouldn't be involved with the government, intimidation. So government, and you look at places in the United States, why has it not worked in the United States in recent years? I mean, we're no model for doing this stuff right at all these days. Part of it is because our government is seen as becoming, has become dysfunctional, because it's become ideologically stressed. There's no common ground. Everything is now, forced into a black and white situation. So people say, I don't want anything to do with government, because government, is part of the problem. And I think that issue has been, global institutions are under assault because they have not always been seen, ever since the financial collapse in 2008. I think people have looked at governments and said, my goodness, they haven't delivered on some of the things. And it's part of the reason why there's been an appeal, this whole notion of China and Russia as these alternative models is sort of because they were filling a space. It's strange to see right-wing politicians going to Moscow. I mean, right-wing European politicians going to Moscow. Why? Because Putin stands for orthodoxy. He doesn't like, the movement, the gay culture. He doesn't, and he's seen as being sort of the right, and it kind of turns the world on its head. All these things, and so my feeling is that Bosnia is symptomatic of it. But I think also the notion in Bosnia as the development, all the states in the former Yugoslavia can be said to have some similar issues, in the sense that, except for Belgrade, they all weren't former capitals. They were regions, and they had, so this development of a culture of a country, in other words, it could develop in places like Belgrade, where it had been this capital, for a long time, and it could. But I think the situation in Bosnia was such that it had to develop a sense of being a country, a sovereign state. It's new. It's very new, and it was divided deeply by a war. And so I think the idea of the formation of a sense of common statehood or common citizenship is still developing and attempting to evolve. And I might say that from my perspective, it strikes me as a deeply urban phenomenon too. What people want Sarajevo is very different than people in the countryside want. And that's a very old divide. That's almost sometimes what I call pre-modern divide. The bourgeois urban area, the country, the rural, rustic population, the whole sense of that divide, that hasn't been necessarily closed in some of the things that have happened since 1995. And I think what people want in the cosmopolitan centers sometimes doesn't always reflect what people want to come, and that gap is still there. And I think that makes for a problem. What you want where you are seems to be very different from what people sometimes want in the countryside. And more work has to be done to bring the two sides together. And I think, so you have a lot of factors pulling in different ways on Bosnia all the time. And I think that it will always be a country, for that reason, that moves more slowly in terms of doing things. A lot of people criticize the United States for being behind on certain social issues. I always remind people that the United States has Massachusetts and Texas in the same country. Bosnia has a similar reality. It has differences that are profound in not all ways, but in some enough ways that the pace will be slower and will be harder to glue together. And that's why, in some ways, the problem, then the war, it's going to take a generation of it one way, That's the thing the other people forget, is that the war created things that a whole generation won't forget. Well, the situation in Europe is clearly one that's reflecting a number of issues. One, immigration is a big issue. Because the stagnating economies, there are not jobs. There's the fear that people are losing their jobs. That their sense of nation statehood in Europe is a particular phenomenon. It is really based on sort of a long tradition of sort of an ethnic identity that is there, and I think that's still a residue. That's a real issue. I think it's the EU has been a contributing factor, because the EU is seen as a sort of a bureaucracy of elites who are not directly accountable. The EU has been also been seen to be by many people on the right as ineffective in dealing with many issues, foreign policy, public policy in the country. Too many laws are being made elsewhere than in the sovereign state. So it's led to a general distrust of institutions, of the whole, what you may call the whole social project of Europe, which was to raise everybody's status, conditions, to have a strong central state that was going to help people rise up and improve the quality of life. Well, those projects don't seem to have worked in a lot of places. And as a result, and with the kinds of social problems that now exist related to those things, you can see why people have looked for politicians who are going to attempt to address these problems for them. And I think a lot of people on the right are saying things like, well, it's all well and good to say this will all work out, but it's not working out, and we want some actions taken. And I think, these things go in cycles. But the main issue is clearly the question of, can the economies, the populations in these countries, the original populations are not reproducing themselves. It's another thing which they see. They see themselves becoming minorities in their own country. And I think those fears, and people naturally fear the loss of the things that they've always treasured. And the idea that life changes so quickly in a globalized world that there is a natural tendency on the part of people to say, I don't want to move so fast into the future. I don't want so much change. I want to be comfortable in the life we live, we have that problem in the United States. If you live on the East Coast and you live in cities like Boston, like I do, where change is always part of the thing, for a lot of people in the rest of the United States, that's just not their world. They don't want to move that fast. They want to move more slowly. They want to keep the situations that they have. It may not all be good, but it's not all bad either. And so you can begin to see why this can naturally lead to conservative tendencies on the part of people. And I think it's wrong that you hear a lot of this in Europe, that the first thing you do is you call all these people fascists. And, you call those people are fascists. And the name calling on these things is always, particularly for an American, it's, fascism has a particular notion of it. But the idea that everybody on the right is automatically a fascist and everybody on the left is already automatically a communist is like, come on. It isn't that true. These people, it's boxing people unfairly. It's creating all false dichotomies. Yes, these people are more to the right, but they're not in the original sense fascists, and sometimes it really isn't, and they're not in the original sense communists in the same way. They're different, and it's an evolving process. Identity is ever changing in Europe. It's shifting. It's moving. And I think people want to kind of, sometimes in trying to freeze it and trying to create these dichotomies, it creates more problems than solutions. And I think that that's a big problem right now. It's just like somebody looking at the other day, I was reading something about ISIS in Iraq. Everybody said there's way too much focus on it. It's making it larger. The nature of what it is capable of and what it's doing much larger than it really is. but focusing on it is ignoring the other elements that are involved in this. And this sudden feeling that ISIS was going to take over all of Iraq and Iraq was suddenly just not going to happen. There are certain things it can do. There are certain things it cannot do, militarily and politically. But because of the fear, suddenly everything was, and you can see why the Obama administration has been very cautious. Go in and bomb. Big problems with just absolutely doing that. Putting our troops back in. That's going to be it. The idea of, and I think these are the kinds of political responses you see in the current environment in the world, where people are wanting very sharp actions. And just like I said earlier about Bosnia, it's not going to happen that way. It's not going to suddenly turn into a citizen republic, with everybody happy and, forgetting who their identity was, that identity. And so it's a question of how do you make haste slowly. There are certain things that you can learn from the events at the time, and the things that changed at the time. The First World War gave rise to the idea of peace as a preferable option, not just the absence of war. Okay, because Europe was bled white. And you can actually say that the First World War changed people's attitudes towards the idea of war as necessarily the only way in which, as a major factor in international relations. It was and continued to be, but people realized how destructive it could be. It became total war. It was no longer purely kind of an economic or imperial situation in which all decisions were about boundaries and borders and getting crops and things like that. It could be much more destructive. And I think the lesson of that is that what it did is it changed the way in which, the Second World War was a byproduct of it. And then everybody realized that what happened is that war, as we knew it, as a result of the First and Second War, could no longer be conducted in that way because it was too destructive. And in an odd sort of way, both those wars, there's a recent book out about what's war good for. I don't know if you've seen this.
No.
Well, one of the interesting things about it is that wars have a tendency in certain circumstances to create long periods of peace and stability, because the historic pattern has been that war states have grown larger and larger. And what happens is larger states, when they encompass areas, tend to, even if it's been through conquest, tend to create inside more stable, peaceful societies. And in one sense, the European Union is a reflection of what the First and Second World War was about. You can't do this. The idea of the war creating, because of their terrible destruction, the circumstances which people would do anything to avoid war again, that the idea of the European Union would be created as a way of saying no more war in Europe. And in one sense, therefore, the lessons we learned is that, warfare on a grand scale like that it had both a very destructive effect, and at the same time, it also created circumstances which we can take hope from now. Yes, the situation with Russia has arisen again, and it is an issue. But I think it was Mark Twain who said that history doesn't repeat itself. It's just there are certain things that look similar, over time. And I think I'm not worried that Europe is on the verge of another world war, another inter-European war. It's just not on. That's just not going to happen. There are too many institutions that have been created within Europe in some ways to make that conflict like that harder and harder and harder to do. NATO is one of them, of course. And one of the things that, for even if you take it back to Bosnia, one of the ways in which the war has been prevented from recurring is by tying constantly the government, the political parties, the politicians, the NGOs, to more and more institutions and structures that make war and conflict harder to do. One of the things you want to do, as a colleague of mine once said, is that you try to bring people through a sluice gate so they go in, but they can't go back out. And the European Union and the United States since 1995 have worked pretty consistently to make it harder and harder for the situation to go back to what it was in 1992. Okay, they've created structures, they've pushed things, they've, you know, and I think that you could say that when you look back at World War I and World War II, that led to the creation of institutions which have, in some ways, kept us. You know, the truth is that up until pre-modern, prehistory, the percentage of the population that died from conflict was approximately something like 10% of the total world population. Since in the 20th century, even with all the wars, the total population that was subjected and eliminated by war was 2%. So it's actually declined. It's actually declined, the cost of it. We're more aware of it because of the media. We're more aware of the reality of conflicts everywhere, but the actual extent of conflict in the world is not as great. And I think part of that is a consequence of what First and Second World War did, both negatively and positively. It shocked people. Both wars shocked people. Because you could say World War II is just merely an extension. But the other thing you could say you learn from history is that you take Second World War and they argue that what the war, some people talk about the war being prolonged by different people, okay? One of the ways in which the Americans fought the war in the West was that they fought a total war. They fought it on all fronts. They didn't fight it just on, like Montgomery wanted to go straight to Berlin. But that would have ended the war, but it might not have ended Nazism. And the goal of the Second World War and the Eisenhower's particular plan was to destroy Germany so that it could not make war and destroy Nazism in the process. And the end result was that, look at where Germany is today. You know, that in many ways it did, there was no question, as there was after the First World War, that maybe the war was unfair to Germany. After the Second World War, there was no question. And in a lot of ways, those kinds of lessons are important ones to take to, for the forward to the present. That no, we're not in the same situation as World War I. World War I and World War II had grave consequences, but they also forced people to compel to address problems in a more fundamental way. NATO was created, the EU was created, the UN was created, the World Bank was created. All these international institutions in an attempt to, let's say, bring the world together. And in some ways, globalization was a byproduct. And on the whole, it's been better than absolutely worse. There are a lot of bad things about it, but on the whole, those things, as consequences of those wars, were good. I think it's important at the centenary of the war to ask questions about, what caused the war. Some people think that it was precisely the balance of power which caused the war. That it was the absence of a dominant hegemonic power that caused all sides to be able to go to war and have this destructive conflict. And that, in a way, you could argue that a Leviathan sometimes in world history has had its benefits. And you could say the United States has been playing that sort of role as a, people may not like it as a big power, but its role, it sees itself as playing a role of sort of regulating, it's a normative thing. I'm going to say that it's not anything but normative. If you don't like that particular vision, you could say that's the cause of all problems, but the truth is that it provides a broad global stability, by its navy, if by nothing else, and that's probably a good thing. On the whole, and it has nothing to do with being nationalist. It has nothing to do with being American. It has more to do with the idea that, and the United States plays that role in Europe still. It plays that role right now. You could say that another thing we've learned from the Second World War and the First World War was the Obama administration was probably really right in saying we're not going to go to war in Ukraine with Russia. That our greatest weapon is our Department of Treasury. that the real weapons now of war have gone beyond the physical weapons of war, and that the weapons of war, the conflict now are, cyberspace. They're non-military things, on some levels. They're, economic issues that you can take down a state economically. It's still not a great thing, but, the idea that it's kept frankly, it has probably kept Russia from invading. The thing has probably kept Russia from invading because the cost to Russia on two fronts. One, if it occupied the country, it'd have guerrilla warfare, which it couldn't. But secondly, the cost economically. So that's probably a byproduct of the First and Second World Wars as well. So the idea is that we don't need more of them, and we've almost made it obsolete. You can't do it. But at the same time, I think that those would be the kinds of lessons I would say is that those wars created the circumstances for a more peaceful, stable world, not without its problems, but even as bad as the situation is in the European Union today, it's a whole lot better than if you had a whole series of independent states, each with their own armies, each armed to the teeth, each competing with one another. I'm happy to see them compete in the World Cup. Almost every country has, in many ways, very few are direct democracies, first of all. Most of them are republics for obvious reasons, because they represent different interests and passions, if you will. This sense of, and I think in Bosnia you have a combination of things. You did have this common idea from Yugoslavia of a common Yugoslav citizenship, which everybody shared, and it was the thing that kept everything glued together. But it was also underpinned by a collective set of identities, different collectivities, right? And so you could almost say that what you had was a situation where, and those identities were not based on necessarily space, but on sort of ethnic, sometimes ethnicity. In a way, that particular strand is the more difficult one to resolve, because communism as such promoted this idea of a collective state. Everybody was in a collective state. Your citizenship was at the state level. But the idea of the individual, you could almost say that one of the challenges in the former Yugoslavia and in the current situation in the Balkans is the idea of the citizen or the individual still has not yet emerged very strongly. That you could argue that on the scale, or let's say state development, that the idea of individual identity is only emerging in part ways in some places. People's identity as individuals is less strong because of this. So you could almost say you have a way of kind of tribal reality and you have a super state. In one way, Yugoslavia was still sort of like an empire. People were bound together, but they didn't all stare at common sense of that citizenship was the paramount thing. This is the problem Russia still has. Russia's still an empire. And it doesn't have this idea of a common citizenship, which everybody wants to be this. And I think that's the challenge that still exists in the former Yugoslavia, is that the idea of individual identity as distinct from the state, as distinct from the ethnic group, has not yet fully emerged except in pockets. And that part of the reason the constitutional structure is the way it is that partly attempts to recognize this and tries to set it within, you might call it, institutional framework that allows it to work, and with the hope that over time some of those interests of groups will devolve, will go away. But I think until that emerges, that stronger sense of individual identity, that my identity isn't first as a member of the RS or as a member of the Federation, this sort of thing, and it becomes more, and I say the RS because the RS is really an ethnic entity, more than anything else. This idea that people think of themselves, well, your real strong identity is being a member of the RS, and, well, what about my individual citizen identity? It's not so strong. And if you took away and I think until those kinds of things start to emerge, and part of that has to be done through a common set of national visions, shared national visions. What do we share in common as opposed to what's different? What are the things that we hold in common? I think that until that actually starts to become more articulated, it won't work as well as it could. You'll be stuck into this combination of, well, we want to. You notice that if you look inside Bosnia and you look at both the Federation and the RS, they're strong states inside themselves. And Bosnia is like Yugoslavia writ large, writ small. And you can almost say that in a funny sort of way, the RS is like it's a powerful state. This idea of of a strong state, but they protest the stronger state. You know what I mean? They want a strong RS, but they don't want a strong central government. The contradiction there is kind of strange when you think about it. They're all for strong local government, but they're not for a strong state government. And that's based on this ethnicity principle, which is fine, but, in terms of the development of a consciousness of statehood, ethnicity has to erode in the modern world if it's going to be successful. And that project is still much harder in Eastern Europe and Southeast Europe than it is in Western Europe. But you can still see it in Western Europe. You can still see it. We don't have that. Our issue is race. In the United States, our issue is race. But being a civic citizen, your civic identity is paramount. That still doesn't really exist so strongly in Bosnia. That concept of a civic identity is secondary and tertiary in some cases. And I think that part of the idea of getting people into the European Union was that it would erode some of those things, these other identities, and that a European identity would take hold. But the problem with the European identity is too nebulous. It's everything and nothing at the same time. Bosnia will be complex for that reason. It has some structures of a state, but as long as ethnic identity is paramount over citizen identity, there will be problems in terms of the full development of what you might call a sense of civic identity in Bosnia. It can't be forced. It can't be forced. And nobody in the international community can come in and say, we're going to change it. Because it wouldn't happen. It would create war. Well, if you use the World War as what is the common lessons for all the people of Bosnia, that, and you take that and say that, that some of the things that I was talking about, if there can be established, you can establish common agreement on areas that are not controversial first. And maybe this thing starting in Sarajevo, was because of certain local things. But in some ways, what I think you could do is try to find out what are the non-controversial things that everybody in Bosnia can agree about on the First World War. And if you focus on those things, it might actually, you can then move to more controversial things that people talk about. But finding that common ground, what do we all agree about on this conflict?